tides of fate are flowing.
Well, if no one else will.
Yours may be heading in. Or out.
Who's to bring her aboard?
Exploring the real identity of Halbrand, the most mysterious character in the Rings of Power. Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Terry and this is Marvelous Videos. The Rings of Power has been creating quite a buzz for both right and wrong reasons. On the one hand, Tolkien's diehard fans do not appreciate the departure from the original lore, while on the other, many admire and love the fresh take on the classic story, playing on the fringes of Tolkien's work. Whichever side of the issue you may be on, there's no denying the fact that certain aspects of the new show are turning out to be quite interesting. One of the most interesting things about the Rings of Power has been the introduction of new characters, and there is none more mysterious than Halbrand. The narrative has teased and tormented the viewers with multiple possibilities, but there's been no clarification so far, leaving it up to speculation and fan theories. In this video, we'll try to get to the bottom of the debates and infer his real identity through some concrete theories. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Now, let's begin. How Halbrand's story arc pans out so far. Before we delve deeper into the multiple theories around the identity of Halbrand, let's first give you a quick recap of his story so far. The character of Halbrand was a hot topic even before the release of the first episode, and fans were speculating if he could be the real evil force in the show. The speculations became further complicated with his first appearance, which was neither dismissive nor accepting of the idea. Halbrand was shown as being stranded on a raft in the middle of an endless ocean, and his whereabouts weren't really clarified. He was just seen alongside a few other survivors who were clearly panicking about some unknown threat. This is when Halbrand had the chance encounter with the elf Galadriel, who was exhausted from swimming non-stop without any clear direction. When one of the survivors on the raft seemed sympathetic towards the plight of a young woman stranded in the sea, he calmly remarked that looks can be deceptive, and he was proven right when the other survivors found that Galadriel was an elf. The hostility was short-lived because they were soon attacked by a giant sea monster. Halbrand was quick to separate his section of the raft from the others, leaving them to die at the cost of his survival. However, he helped Galadriel on board and seemed nonchalant about his selfish act of sacrificing others for his own sake. The two were soon caught up in a deadly storm, and when Galadriel was dragged underwater, he went out of his way to save her life. This was quite contradictory to his behavior a while ago, and it became clear that the showrunners want to keep the suspense alive without branding him directly as good or bad. Eventually, Galadriel and Halbrand were found floating around by a Númenórean ship, and they were brought before the Queen Regent of Númenor. Galadriel, being the proud, righteous and arrogant elf, soon got caught in a war of words with the Queen, and it required Halbrand's manipulative efforts to ease the situation. Galadriel's demand of a passage back to Middle-earth was dismissed, but Halbrand's actions ensured that diplomacy prevailed. Another noticeable thing about Halbrand during his time in Númenor was his desperation to be a guildsman. He even offered to work for free, promising that his work would be the best in the land. Even such tall claims couldn't get him the job, and he went to the extent of trying to steal a guildsman's badge to be able to forge weapons and other stuff at the blacksmith's shop. When the guildsman and his friends challenged Halbrand, he was reluctant but didn't shy away from a fight, which clearly highlighted his skills as a warrior. His retaliation was so ferocious that the men didn't stand a chance, but the guards arrived and ensured that Halbrand was put behind bars for his crimes. Meanwhile, there was a major revelation through Galadriel, when she found out the insignia worn by Halbrand as a necklace was actually the symbol of the rightful ruler of the Southlands. Once again, Halbrand retained the mystery around him by neither outright denying nor accepting the theory. Finally, when Galadriel managed to convince the Queen Regent to gather an army and send it alongside her to fight Sauron in the Southlands, Halbrand was released from the prison cell. He didn't seem too pleased about having to go back there again, but eventually he agreed to become part of the expedition. Our main takeaway from the entire story arc? Halbrand could still be just about anything at the end of 5 episodes. Amazon Studios describe him as a man who's running from his past and whose future is entwined with Galadriel's, but that's just as vague as what we've seen so far. Could Halbrand be the King of the Dead? Before we head into the serious discussions about Halbrand being Sauron, let's get the more outrageous theories out of the way first. A section of the fans seem to believe that he could be the unnamed king who rules the undead Men of the Mountains. The Men of the Mountains, according to Tolkien, were worshippers of Sauron before Gondor's founding. It adds up nicely if you consider how the Men of the Southlands, who could well be Halbrand's subjects, seem pretty devoted to Sauron and were previously loyal to Morgoth. In Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King, this was quite an interesting concept, and you've seen a brief glimpse of the King of the Dead in the 2003 movie version. The only major issue here is that the timeline doesn't quite add up. The Men of the Mountains are not really a part of Middle-earth's storyline, but it must also be taken into consideration that the Rings of Power does play around and alter the original timeline quite a bit.
For it was his ancestor who swore a blood oath
To Morgoth.
Halbrand could be the Witch King of Angmar, Lord of the Nazgul. Yes, a majority of the fan speculations are all about Halbrand being Sauron, but let's check out the other big possibility first. The third episode actually did enough to hint that he could be Sauron's second in command, the Witch King of Angmar. Those who are familiar with Tolkien's lore will know that during the second and third ages of Middle-earth, he was Sauron's right-hand man. His exact origins are left as a mystery, but the Witch King is believed to be one of the noble lords of Numenor who were corrupted by the 9 Rings of Power. As for Halbrand, this fresh character introduced in the Rings of Power could still be Sauron, but there are certain factors that point otherwise. For instance, he seems to have both physical and emotional weaknesses, and unless he is really trying to mask his identity too hard, it's unlikely that Sauron would have any of that. Besides, the very first scene that introduced him portrayed him as being vulnerable in a situation that didn't really require him to put up an act. Sauron wouldn't bother about a few other mortal humans on a raft, and wouldn't care about travelling with them to safety. His place in the multiple story arcs is also not very convincing, if you want to consider him as Sauron. Ideally, the evil lord should be somewhere forging rings instead of wasting his time in Numenor and listening to Galadriel's whims and fancies. Of course, things could have a different twist altogether, and this theory could be proven wrong with certain manipulations of the plot. While you might debate the chances of Halbrand being Sauron, there's hardly a speck of doubt around him being a negative character. From the very beginning, he has shown signs of being selfish and concerned about some hidden goal that he has. He was guilt-free about letting the others die to save his life from the attack of the underwater creature, and the only glitch here is why he went out of his way to save Galadriel, unless of course he had his own interests behind that. Irrespective of his little saving act, it's safe to assume that he is not some hopeless good guy stuck in a big bad world. It makes sense if Halbrand is simply among the men who got corrupted by the influence of the Rings of Power given by Sauron. Not much is known about the background of these men, which gives the showrunners the golden opportunity to create something around it without the rights to the main works of Tolkien. They fit perfectly in the Rings of Power story arc, and it doesn't seem too far-fetched that at some point we will come across the Nazgul before they're corrupted by the rings. Coming back to the whole Halbrand being the Witch King of Angmar theory, while we know nothing about the backstory of the character, it would work nicely if he was a brave warrior and leader of sorts. Halbrand has shown signs of his urge to survive the odds, and his violent tendencies have also been witnessed during his fight in the streets. If this is the case, then Halbrand is yet to be given the Ring of Power, and the event will take place somewhere in the future, probably after he is out in the wilderness with Galadriel and they meet the likes of Celebrimbor and Elrond. As we've said before, we could be totally wrong here, but there's far too much smoke in this theory for the possibility of a grand fire underneath.
A cruel and cunning sorcerer. They called him Sauron.
Could it be the obvious? Halbrand as Sauron himself. Isn't the main villain in the show supposed to be Sauron? Well, yes, and we haven't seen anything more than a hazy shadow of him so far, and it has been 5 episodes. Naturally, with every new character popping up, the discussions immediately shift to the possibility of him being Sauron, the mysterious wizard man encountered by Nori, a member of the Harfoot clan, or Halbrand, the man who claims to hold back information about himself, became the prime suspects, and if we have to put our money on one of them, it has to be the latter. It seems only logical that the Dark Lord is still out there somewhere in Middle-earth, and an abundance of clues point to the same. The organization in the army of the Orcs led by Adar, who was also considered to be Sauron for a while, signifies the build-up for something far bigger. Halbrand does seem like a mortal human, but that alone is not going to be enough to dismiss the possibility of him being Sauron. One of his very first dialogues in the show says that appearances can be deceptive, and Tolkien's lore has everything to suggest that Sauron is a master shapeshifter. He could take any form he liked, and even posing as a mortal human wouldn't be a challenge for him. One of the biggest questions that we come across while dealing with Halbrand's backstory heads back to the first scene, where we see him sailing in a shattered raft in the middle of nowhere. Where did he come from? And more importantly, where was he headed? The elves sailing to Valinor have to head west, and the only mortal men who sail there are headed towards Numenor. While Halbrand has not yet confirmed that he was going to Numenor, it does seem like the likely inference. It could be the only safe passage when his own lands had been threatened. If he is indeed Sauron, it makes sense why he would want to head for Numenor, given that Sauron eventually takes a major role in the destruction of the land. Halbrand's necklace is another added mystery, which accentuates the possibility of him being something truly evil. If you look closely, you'll find a vial in his necklace which is probably filled with some liquid. According to Tolkien's lore, elves, orcs and ents all have their own concoction in Middle-earth, and their Dark Lord having it as well makes complete sense. He claims to be from the Southlands, and Galadriel discovers that he is actually the rightful ruler of the people of the Southlands. While this could simply be a tactic to mislead Galadriel, Southlands is the region where the dark forces are growing in power. In the maps, this is the region that will later be signified as Mordor, and it adds further juice to the chances of Halbrand being the Dark Lord himself. Those who are familiar with the appendices of Lord of the Rings will know that Sauron is taken prisoner by the King of Numenor, and Halbrand spending some time as a prisoner here as well is an uncanny similarity. However, one thing doesn't quite add up here. Halbrand is shown to be extremely reluctant to leave Numenor and head to the Southlands, and Sauron shouldn't really behave like that, unless of course he's simply trying to stay on top of his deception game. It must also be considered that Tolkien's work points out how Sauron corrupted the King of Numenor and eventually led to the destruction of the land by the godlike entity in this universe, Valar. The visions of a giant wave destroying Numenor have hinted that the narrative might head in that direction, and Halbrand being Sauron suddenly becomes the missing piece from the puzzle. All these, combined with some twisted, suggestive dialogues like Halbrand stating that he's not the hero or admitting that he's done terrible things in his past, only add to the chances of him being Sauron. It'll be a real bummer if he turns out to be some random lame character after all the build-up, but from the looks of it, it's unlikely that the presence of Halbrand will be uneventful. One of the showrunners, J.D. Payne, revealed that Sauron is there in the series in a way that people aren't expecting, and with the clues that we have so far, Halbrand does come across as the most likely candidate. Whatever the real identity of Halbrand might be, there's no denying the fact that his presence in the show makes things far more interesting. The showrunners purposely seem to keep the mystery alive, and the ultimate reveal will be when we get to know for sure who Halbrand really is. Until then, let us know in the comments below about your thoughts around his identity. We can agree to disagree as long as you have good enough logic to suggest a different theory. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one. Thanks for watching and see you next time.